Let us pray. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our salvation. Amen. Good morning again. As you will recall, with a few interruptions along the way, this summer we had been exploring what it means to have a theology of place. We looked at the deep geological history of this very spot. We examined what happened when our Christian worldview smacked into, really ran over, the worldview of the people who've been living here for tens of thousands of years before we arrived. But today, as we all strive to make sense of a very bizarre and rapidly changing world around us, I want us to think about a more recent timeline. I want us to think about our histories, our family histories. What are the generational sagas that brought each of us into this place and time? What's the cultural baggage that we all brought with us from that journey, and how does that shape how we see the world, how we see each other, and of course, how we see God? And of course, I can't preach about all your stories all at once. That's just not going to work. So I'm going to preach about a little bit out of my own family history, and I hope that in sharing a little bit of our saga of how we first arrived on the West Coast of the United States and what happened to our family when we got here, that maybe you will hear some common themes as you reflect on your own family story. So here's the drama. It starts like this. It starts in a little suburb of Sacramento, California called Rio Linda. Anyone ever been to Rio Linda before? Very good. That's shocking to me and wonderful. So the saga of Rio Linda is not atypical. It plays out in small towns all across America. Once upon a time, Rio Linda was a farming town. Once upon a time, the entire Sacramento Valley was bustling with migrant farmers like my own family who had lost their self-sufficiency from the Dust Bowl when ruined their farm in Oklahoma. They'd gotten farms from the Homestead Act that brought them east. It ruined their farms, and so of course they then moved to California to start a new life. Now, spoiler alert, the life of a migrant farm worker isn't the most glamorous and fancy life. But there was, back then, when this iteration of workers was doing it, there was enough Hank Williams honky-tonk music to go around, and for my family, enough flirting and scandal and adventure to go with it. But by the 1950s, post-war money started to pour into California in a big, big way. As the highways continued to spread, and the advent of the suburbs meant a seemingly endless number of new, ever-booming construction jobs. This meant work for my family. They didn't have to keep running around in little jalopies. So it wasn't quite the same thing as self-sufficiency. Much of my family remembers chafing at the idea that they were not working for themselves. This was a bitter pill. But the jobs kept them from eating wild rabbit every night. It kept them from scrounging around and boiling up weeds they found to eat. And it put, occasionally, roofs over their heads. No matter that later on, when they got houses, that the bank owned the majority of these little dwellings, didn't really matter because there's always this idea that if you kept working and you worked hard enough and long enough, you would pay it off and maybe you could make things better for your kids than it had been for us. And for a long time, that looked like it worked. The next generation, my parents' generation, and some of yours, they hit the sweet spot of the expansion suburban dream. And though they didn't really listen to Hank Williams' music anymore, they were now entirely dependent on this suburban economy. That was true. They were able to go to college. They were able to buy homes, maybe even a few toys. American success story. If you work hard and you're born in the right time, you can get all the things. But what has happened now to towns like Rio Linda since then is very, very important for us to hear today in 2018. And it's a story that does not get told very well, in my opinion. We look at all the symptoms of what happened, but to my mind, not something core to it. Because in Rio Linda, the old cherry tree farms were eventually replaced when the family farms were bought up by expanding agribusiness. It was eventually replaced by big industrial chicken farms designed to produce food for all the suburbs. But it is an interesting fact that wherever you get big industrial chicken farming in the United States, because of all the tons of chicken excrement that's produced, the nitrates in that excrement, you will always get mass crystal meth production. It follows the chicken industry around this country like cause and effect. Fun fact, if you didn't know. Once upon a time, Rio Linda becomes the crystal meth capital of the United States. And the proud sons and daughters of cherry tree farmers whose parents had once owned the land now couldn't make enough to pay their bills by working on the land where chicken farms now existed. And many of these people, in the absence of any other kind of income to provide for their families, they turned to the illegal drug trade. And I'm not going to defend that. I'm not going to glamorize it. But I do want us to draw a little picture around that. Because once all of the private farms had been outmaneuvered, once they'd all been legislated against, so only a few big companies could own all those farms, and then once the sprawl of the suburbs and the strip malls started to run their course and there was no room for them to expand, once there was no more accumulated wealth from ownership that kept people with money to expand those areas, the construction jobs dried up. And the factory jobs moved overseas. And when all of that money that had once fed that constant post-war expansion started to constrict down back again into the core, what remained on the edges were the dried up husks of boarded up buildings and businesses and people who had no resources left. And what you're left with are the social ruins of an economy that could never hope to sustain itself in the long run. Now, I'm going to take a quick aside, a little generational moment here. Because if you are of a certain age, and if you have ever wondered why all these kids seem obsessed with zombie apocalypse movies or post-apocalyptic films, which is really the only genre left we have, dystopian drama. If you ever wondered why that is, why it is that they're so into it, it's part of it because this reflects the very real horror that they have grown up being afraid of. And it's been slowly creeping inward from around the edges for a long time in the form of economic ruin. Go to Rio Linda and you'll see it clearly. But it's more and more true for cities across America. And maybe some of you are from some of those cities. Maybe you have friends who still live there and you try to understand what their life is like, what their beliefs are, what causes them to do what they're doing, why do they vote the way they vote. And even if you're not from one of those places, the same dynamic is working right here in supposedly booming Portland. Because if you don't have your own property, and if you don't have your own business or savings or something, whatever it is, paychecks equal survival. Paychecks equal life and death. And because the cost of basic things in our times, like housing and healthcare and education, have all skyrocketed as a proportion of the budget, you'll forgive me, I was a public finance analyst, this is how I see the world. If you're not aware of this, that this has been happening even while jobs have become harder to come by. One of the ways that you ward off financial apocalypse is by going into debt, which, by the way, 78% of all American households are in debt over their heads. That's a staggering number, if you didn't know. But back to my own family story just for a second. The other way to ward off economic ruin is by selling drugs. Because when the barter economy of the lower class, by the way, it's only the middle class that uses money, right? Yeah, it's true. That's another sermon right there. Murdoch doesn't pay for a Mercedes, they give him a Mercedes. And my Aunt Joy has never used money in her entire life. When the barter economy of the lower class has stretched as far as it can in any given area, the drug trade is one of the very few resources that anyone has left. And this tragedy goes beyond just what we see on the symptoms of our streets here in Portland. It goes beyond just addiction and public health crisis. On top of that, there's this thing called the war on drugs in our country, which, if you didn't know, is really just a war on poor people in this country. Instead of acknowledging and addressing the underlying social and economic realities of our times, it has been much easier for the United States to criminalize generations of black people and brown people and even some of the white sons and daughters of cherry tree farmers, still trying to find some way of self-sufficiency in their life. And let me tell you, with this comes a lot of shame and alienation and heartbreak and people who don't talk to siblings for generations, parents who are dead to their children. With this comes heartbreak and bigotry and scapegoating, and above all else, the crushing guilt that you couldn't take care of your family. You couldn't somehow pull yourself up from your goddamn bootstraps. Of course, people were going to look for someone else to blame. Of course, they were going to vote for someone who told them it wasn't their fault. Even if that person came along and pointed in the exact opposite direction of where the difficulty was. Even if that person pointed at the new migrant farm workers instead of the American oligarchs who actually hoard all of our money and resources from the people actually out there doing the work. Now, if there is enough of a financial cushion around you that none of this sounds familiar to you, give thanks. But know this, the story of Riolinda is not just my family's story. It is the writing on the wall for all of us. And if you don't realize that it's coming yet, it is here. In the public finance world, it's always obvious, and it's been obvious for a while now, that ballooning debt is always an early warning sign that an economy, a way of life, of how resources move around, that it's grown too sick to survive in its current forms. And here in America, we are the generation of human individuals living that get to finally start dealing with the consequences of that checkered history. So at the risk of not sounding dramatic enough, let me rephrase our situation in the form of a Bible story. Like the Hebrews, living in Egypt, our American way of life has grown untenable. And because of this, we are now entering into a new kind of wilderness. And just because this wilderness is one filled with glass and gravel and weeds behind broken down buildings and businesses and people, doesn't change the fact that it is a wilderness. And it's creeping in all around us, and it's always been there. And now we face the proposition of either losing each other one by one as we slip into it as isolated individuals, or moving directly into it. and finding a new kind of community there together. In the book of Exodus, the Hebrews didn't have an easy time with that. Even at the foot of Mount Sinai, with Egypt far behind them, they had a really hard time letting go of their old habits and customs and routines and the way they thought about themselves. And finally, the time comes where Yahweh's like, everyone out of the pool. I'm going to burn you all. But in the story that Moki read this morning, a turning point happens when Moses himself tries to intervene. Moses begs Yahweh to spare them, and it's as if God had been testing Moses, waiting for this exact reply, because it is this mercy, not God's mercy, but Moses' mercy, a guy who'd been really wronged by all these people for a while, his forgiveness that turns the whole situation around and allows the Hebrews for a fresh start. Now, obviously, I think there's a certain kind of wisdom in this for us. Because what really keeps us locked in the same destructive patterns isn't the economy, it's not how much money we have or somebody else have. What keeps us locked in the same destructive patterns are the emotional habits, the emotional routines and addictions, a sense of self that we keep passing down from one generation to the next. And our economy is just one diagram of that cycle. It's like pouring a little radioactive dye to see the whole thing and what's really happening. But underneath our massive looming debt crisis, underneath that there is a different kind of crisis that's much more difficult to name. It's the crisis that comes when certain patterns have run their course and a new vision of the world is required. Our church, our country needs a new vision of the world, and we've known about it for a while. And so people have held conferences, and they've had workshops and strategic planning visions, statements. But let me tell you, that never works. Because it is still the same vision pushing itself around with new papers. It doesn't work. And let me just say, here's where the whole thing gets a little mystical crazy sounding, because new vision does not come from such things. Good and new vision only comes when we practice forgiveness, both for ourselves and for everyone around us. Fun fact, that's the thing that Jesus says the most. He's calling amnesty on everyone for not knowing what they were doing. So for your consideration this week, debt forgiveness is actually a far easier thing to offer everyone than real forgiveness. Real forgiveness is necessarily really emotional, and it's something that happens far less than is generally supposed, I think. I forgive you. Well, sort of. But because we are, for the most part, materialists, it takes something material like debt forgiveness to remind us just how important real forgiveness is. What if we let everyone off the hook for everything? What would it be like if one day we just started saying as a civilization, you know what? Let's just assume that now all of our debts to each other are paid. Let's just remember that there is nothing that we have or that we did, not ourselves. There's nothing we own that we didn't get from someone else. Nothing's really ours, not really. So why don't we just go ahead, call it even, and figure out a new way for everyone to have enough so long as we're willing to, share. This will get me a death threat. But I think it's Christianity, I really do. What would if we just applied Christianity to our economy? For your consideration this week, what would that look like economically? And what would that look like emotionally? What would happen if we took all the people in situations that have hurt us and hurt our families and just let them off the hook? What would happen if we let ourselves off the hook? Something tells me that if Thanksgiving was a really good and worthy practice for the first part of our ancestors of American history to practice, then forgiveness giving is really the more appropriate holiday now at this side of American history. But let's put that to a test. Your assignment this week is to visualize all those inherited stories and patterns that you bring with you into this room that are currently begging for forgiveness. I bring with me the Dust Bowl and migrant farm workers and crystal meth factories and how irresponsible I was for taking on student loan debts that I'd never pay off to go to seminary. It's really the modern equivalent of buying magic beans. What do you bring with you? What's your baggage? It doesn't have to be economic, but whatever it is, I want you to visualize it as best you can. Whatever comes up in your mind, and I want us to imagine that we can all once again lift off the surface of time for a moment and see all those scattered histories, all those places in Russia or Germany or Bolivia, wherever it is we came from that brought us here to this moment while we hold for a second in this sanctuary before scattering out again in all directions. What's going to happen if we carry on the way we've been? But more important, what could happen? If we decided right here and now to forgive ourselves all those things we did. What if we forgave everyone else for all the things that they did? And what if we called Jubilee on all the things that bind us? What would that feel like? What would that mean for us? And where do we go from here? Amen.